stop. Before you watch another perfect clip of this family, you need to hear what I've been holding back. For years, I was told to stay quiet. I was told that family loyalty comes before the truth. But when you see the walls of the compound closing in, you realize loyalty is just another word for control. I've watched my cousins suffer in silence while the cameras kept rolling and the smiles stayed plastered on. Tonight, the NDAs don't matter. The threats don't matter. I'm pulling back the curtain on the secrets they thought they buried under the garden of Town. This isn't a reality show episode. This is the reality they don't want you to see. I'm Amy Duggar King, and this is the full, unedited truth about the Duggar Empire. For years, I was labeled the rebel. In the Duggar world, being a rebel doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It just means you're thinking for yourself. I'm Amy, and I've spent my entire life watching from the sidelines as my cousins were raised in a world that felt more like a fortress than a home. People ask me all the time, Amy, why are you talking now? The answer is simple. The truth doesn't have an expiration date. Growing up, I was the girl in the jeans. I was the girl who listened to worldly music. To the outside world, I was just a normal teenager, but inside the Town circle, I was a danger. I was the bad influence because I showed the girls that there was a world outside the fence. I remember the hushed whispers when I'd walk into the big house. I remember the way Jim Bob would look at me like I was a ticking time bomb. I'm not here to tear down my family. I'm here to tear down the walls of silence that have protected the wrong people for far too long. This is the start of a very long, very honest conversation. We are going deep and we aren't turning back. Let's talk about the big house. On TV, it looked like a dream, a massive custom built home for a massive happy family. But have you ever noticed how many locks were on those doors? Have you ever noticed the cameras that weren't for TLC, but for internal monitoring? Walking into that house felt like stepping into a different century. The air felt heavy. Everything was curated. From the pantry stocked with industrial-sized cans to the dormitory-style bedrooms where privacy was a foreign concept. In that house, you were never alone. Constant supervision was disguised as accountability, but it was actually surveillance. Jim Bob didn't just build a house, he built a controlled environment where every word spoken was filtered through the family's rigid doctrine. I remember the feeling of leaving that house after a visit, the literal sigh of relief I'd take when I got into my car and drove away. Because inside those walls, you weren't an individual, you were a unit of a brand. And if you didn't fit the brand, the fortress would squeeze you until you did. In the Duggar world, modesty wasn't just about clothing. It was a weapon used to control women from the time they could walk. We've all seen the long skirts and the layered shirts, but what you didn't see was the psychological toll. The girls were taught that their bodies were a stumbling block for men. Think about that for a second. Little girls were told they were responsible for the thoughts of grown men. They used the word Nike as a code to look at the floor. If a woman in revealing clothes walked by, it turned the outside world into a minefield of sin. This obsession with modesty created a culture of shame. It made the girls feel like they had to hide who they were to be godly. But here's the irony. While they were so focused on the length of a skirt, they were completely ignoring the actual predators within their own circle. Modesty was the distraction. It was the shiny object they used to make the family look holy while the real rot was being swept under the rug, it wasn't about God. It was about power and the submissiveness of women. The buddy system. It sounded so cute on the show, didn't it? A big kid helping a little kid. But let's call it what it really was, parentification. Michelle didn't raise those kids. The older daughters did. Jana, Jill, Jessa, and Jinger weren't just sisters, they were sister moms. They were changed diapers, homeschooling, and disciplining toddlers while they were still children themselves. I saw the exhaustion in their eyes. Imagine being 13 years old and being legally and emotionally responsible for 3 or 4 younger siblings. They lost their childhoods to the buddy system. And why? So the parents could keep having more children without the actual labor of raising them. This system created a strange, fractured family dynamic. The bonds between the buddies were often stronger than the bonds with the parents. But it also meant that if a child was hurting or being abused, they weren't going to a mother or father. They were going to a sister who was just as powerless as they were. The system wasn't designed for the kids' benefit. It was designed for the parents' convenience. If you want to understand the Duggars, you have to understand Jim Bob's obsession with control, specifically financial control. He was the gatekeeper. Every TLC check, every book deal, every public appearance fee, it all went through him. The adult children were working full time for a reality show for years, yet many of them had no bank accounts of their own. He used money as a leash. If you stayed sweet and followed the rules, you got a house or a car. If you questioned him, the tap was turned off. This is why it took so long for anyone to speak out. How do you leave a cult-like environment when you have 5 kids and $0 in your name? He ensured they were dependent on him for their basic survival. It's the ultimate power move. He didn't just want to be the father, he wanted to be the CEO, the pastor, and the judge. When you control a person's livelihood, you control their voice. But as we've seen recently, once that grip starts to slip, the whole empire begins to crumble. The iron grip is rusting, and the truth is finally leaking out. We have to talk about the elephant in the room, the shadow that has loomed over this family for 20 years. Josh. For the longest time, he was the golden boy, the firstborn, the one destined for politics. But behind the scenes, there was a rot that we all felt but weren't allowed to name. When the first allegations came out privately years ago, the family didn't call the police. They called the elders. They shielded him. They put the burden of forgiveness on the victims before the victims even understood what had happened to them. I remember the tension during those years. It was like living in a house where the walls were bleeding and everyone was just busy repainting them white. The Josh shadow wasn't just about his crimes, it was about the culture of protectionism. The family's reputation was placed on a pedestal while the safety of the children was buried beneath it. Watching the world finally see the truth during his trial was agonizing, but it was also a moment of terrifying clarity. The system was designed to protect the predator, not the innocent. Imagine your entire life is an audition. Every morning you wake up, and before you can even rub the sleep from your eyes, there's a camera crew in your kitchen. That was the Duggar reality. But here's the secret. The show wasn't just documenting their life, it was creating it. Decisions weren't made based on what was best for the kids. They were made based on what made for a wholesome storyline. The kids learned to speak in TLC sound bites. They learned to hide their bad days and perform their happiness. If you weren't smiling, you weren't joyfully available. This created a massive psychological split. There was the TV Duggar, perfect, modest, and serene. And then there was the real Duggar, exhausted, confused, and trapped. They were child stars who didn't get a paycheck, performing in a reality show that was actually a carefully constructed advertisement for their father's belief system. When the red light on the camera went off, the smiles often vanished, but the pressure to be perfect never did. Let's get into the courtship rules. To the viewers, it looked like a quaint, old-fashioned way of dating, side hugs only, no hand holding until engagement, no kissing until the altar. It seemed sweet to some, but in reality, it was a high-stakes contract negotiation. Jim Bob was the primary negotiator. He didn't just vet the guys, he interviewed them like they were applying for a corporate merger. The questionnaires he made the suitors fill out were dozens of pages long, covering everything from their debt to their deepest theological views. The girls often had very little say. It wasn't about a spark or a connection. It was about finding a man who would fit into the family's power structure. These courtships were designed to move fast, usually just a few months, to ensure the couple didn't have time to actually get to know each other's flaws. It was a rush to the altar fueled by repressed hormones and parental pressure. Many of these kids were essentially marrying strangers under the watchful eye of a national audience. The weddings were the climax of every season. Thousands of guests, massive cakes, and that first kiss that everyone waited for. But if you look closely at the footage, you can see the panic in some of their eyes. For these girls, the wedding day wasn't just a celebration. It was the day they were handed over, literally. The transfer of authority went from Jim Bob to the new husband. I remember being at those weddings and feeling the weight of it. These girls were going from a home where they couldn't even go to the grocery store alone to a marriage where they were expected to be sexually active and start a family immediately. There was no transition period, no time to find themselves. They went from being property of the father to helpmeets for the husband. The glamour of the white dress masked a very scary reality. They were jumping into a life they weren't prepared for, all for the sake of a TV finale. Then came the crack in the foundation that no one expected. Jill was the rule follower. She was the one who did everything by the book. But when she and Derek started asking questions about where the money was going, the money they earned from filming their own lives, the golden child status was stripped away instantly. Jill's breaking point wasn't just about money, it was about boundaries. She wanted the right to say no to filming. She wanted the right to choose her own doctors. And for that simple act of independence, she was effectively exiled. I watched her go through the pain of being cut off from her siblings, of being the outsider at family events. But I also watched her find her strength. Jill's departure proved the ultimate truth about the Duggar family. Their love is conditional. If you follow the script, your family. If you write your own, you're a threat. Jill chose herself, and in doing so, she gave everyone else permission to wonder if they could do the same. While some of my cousins became household names, there's a group I call the Lost Duggars. These are the middle and younger siblings who grew up while the cameras were already a permanent fixture. They didn't know a life without a microphone clipped to their shirt. For them, the lost years were the times when the novelty of the show wore off, but the strictness of the lifestyle only intensified. I've looked into their eyes at family gatherings and seen a specific kind of hollow gaze. It's the look of someone who knows they are being watched, but feels completely invisible. These siblings saw the older ones leave, some in triumph, some in disgrace, and they are left wondering what their own exit strategy looks like. They are the ones currently navigating a world that has turned against their last name, all while trying to figure out who they are without a script. The trauma of the younger siblings is a story that hasn't fully been told yet, but the cracks are starting to show in the way they interact with the world. We need to talk about the honeymoon phase because in this family, it's not what you think. Imagine being told your entire life that even a touch is dangerous, that your body is a temple that must remain boarded up and locked. Then, in the span of a 3-minute ceremony, you are told to open everything up. There is no middle ground. There is no conversation about consent, pleasure, or even basic anatomy. I've talked to women who came out of that culture, and the wedding night is often described as a shock to the system. Physically and emotionally, you are expected to go from 0 to 60 with a man you've never been alone with for a single hour. The pressure to populate the earth starts on night 1. This isn't romance, it's a biological mandate wrapped in a white veil. The psychological damage of flipping that switch so violently is something many of these girls are still processing in therapy today. They weren't prepared to be wives, they were prepared to be vessels. Yet, to understand why they act the way they do, you have to look at the IBLP, the Institute in Basic Life Principles. This wasn't just a church, it was a blueprint for a subculture. Bill Gothard, the founder, created an umbrella of authority. God is at the top, then the father, then the mother, then the children. If you step out from under the father's umbrella, you are supposedly unprotected from Satan. This is how the fear is maintained. It's a hierarchy of control. The IBLP teachings are what dictated the homeschooling curriculum, the music, and the belief that mental health issues are just spiritual failures. They don't believe in psychology. They believe in more prayer and more submission. Even though the family has tried to distance themselves from Gothard publicly after his own scandals came to light, the DNA of his teachings is baked into every corner of that Tontatown house. You can take the family out of the IBLP, but it's much harder to take the IBLP out of the family. December 2021, that was the day the mask didn't just slip, it shattered into a million pieces. The trial of Josh Duggar. For years, the family had managed to spin the mistakes of his youth as something that was dealt with. But federal charges involving the most horrific images imaginable. You can't spin that. You can't pray away a federal investigation. I was there in spirit. And I was there in my heart for the victims. Watching Jim Bob and Michelle walk into that courthouse, trying to maintain that same stoic, joyful composure was sickening. It was the first time they couldn't control the narrative. The judge, the jury, and the law didn't care about their umbrella of authority. This trial was the ultimate proof that the system they built to protect their witness to the world was actually a breeding ground for darkness. It broke the family's heart, but more importantly, it broke their power. The world finally saw what happens when you prioritize a brand over the safety of children. Hair is a little secret Jim Bob hates. He can control the house, but he can't control the cloud. There is a digital underground within the Duggar family. Yes, there are group chats. There are unauthorized threads where the siblings and cousins talk without the filters. It's where the real support happens. It's where someone can say, "Hey, I'm struggling with what dad said today," and actually get an honest answer. This is where the revolution is happening in the palm of their hands. They are sharing resources, sharing books that were once banned, and validating each other's feelings. It's a lifeline. For a family built on isolation, the internet has been the ultimate great escape. Every time a sibling likes a rabble post or follows someone outside the circle, it's a tiny act of defiance. The walls of Tontatown might be thick, but they aren't Wi-Fi proof. The younger generation is waking up one text message at a time, and they are realizing that the world isn't as scary as they were told. If Jill was the first to break the door down, Jinger was the one who walked through it and redesigned her entire world. We all remember Free Jinger, the slogan people used for years. But seeing her now living in Los Angeles, wearing pants, and more importantly, speaking with her own theological voice is nothing short of a miracle. Jinger didn't just leave the house. She left the ideology. She did the hard work of deconstruction. She had to pick apart her faith piece by piece and ask, is this God? Or is this just Gothard? Watching her journey has been a lesson in grace. She didn't become bitter. She became better. She showed the rest of the family that you can still have a relationship with the divine without having a relationship with a dictator. She traded the umbrella of authority for a life of actual freedom. Her transformation is a quiet, powerful threat to the Duggar system because it proves that there is a beautiful, fulfilling life waiting on the other side of the fence. Let's talk about the TLC money. Everyone thinks the Duggars are sitting on a mountain of gold. But fame has a high price and a very short shelf life. When the show was canceled, the reality set in. Most of these adult children had no resumes, no college degrees, and no specialized skills. They had been trained to be TV personalities, but that job title doesn't pay the mortgage once the cameras leave. I've seen the scramble, the sponsored Instagram posts, the desperate attempts at YouTube channels, the selling of used clothes online. It's the fallout of being raised in a gilded cage. They were used to build a multi-million-dollar brand, but when the brand collapsed under the weight of scandal, many were left with nothing but a recognizable face and a lot of trauma. Jim Bob's financial control meant that they didn't have safety nets. They were millionaires on paper and broke in practice. The fame they were forced into as children became the very thing that made it impossible for them to live normal, private lives as adults. This is perhaps the hardest part to talk about the shunning. In the Duggar family, if you aren't an ally, you are an enemy. There is no agree to disagree. I've watched as Jim Bob, and Michelle have distanced themselves from their own flesh and blood because those children chose to tell the truth. It's a classic cult tactic. I isolate the troublemaker to keep the rest of the group from being infected by their ideas. They use the younger siblings as pawns. They tell them that the ones who left are lost or dangerous. Imagine the heartbreak of a younger sister being told she can't visit her older sister's house because it's not a godly environment. It's a form of emotional blackmail. Stay with us or lose your family. I've felt the sting of it myself. But here's what they don't realize. You can't kill a sister's love with a decree. You can't stop a brother from wondering. The alienation is backfiring because the more they push people away, The more the ones inside start to wonder what their parents are so afraid of. Healing isn't a straight line. For me, and for many of my cousins, it's a daily choice. It starts with therapy, real therapy, not biblical counseling where you're told to just pray harder. It starts with acknowledging that what happened to us wasn't normal. It wasn't healthy. And it definitely wasn't holy. I've had to unlearn so many things. I've had to learn that it's okay to be angry. It's okay to set boundaries. It's okay to say no to family members who hurt you. Healing means looking in the mirror and seeing a person, not a witness for a brand. I see my cousins finding their footing, some through writing, some through motherhood on their own terms, some through just staying quiet and living a private life. We are the survivors of a social experiment that played out on national television. And the fact that we are still standing, still breathing, and still searching for joy is our greatest victory. We've reached the end of this story, but for many, the cycle is still happening. My final message isn't for the Duggars, it's for you. If you are in a situation where you are told that your questions are sin, leave. If you are told that your body is a problem and your voice doesn't matter, leave. If you are told that loyalty means covering up crimes, run. The Duggar story is a cautionary tale about what happens when we idolize family and religion over truth and safety. Don't be fooled by the bright lights and the 8K resolution of a perfect Instagram feed. Real life is messy, and real faith should be able to handle the truth. To my cousins, I love you, and the door is always open. To the viewers, thank you for listening to the parts of the story that didn't make it to the TV screen. The curtain is closed, the cameras are off, and for the first time in a long time, we are finally free. I'm Amy Duggar King, and this is the end of the silence.